and welcome to Interfaces for the Earthverse by Oscar Santillán. This event forms part of the speaker series Afro and Indigenous Futures, organized by the Liberal Studies Student Association at the New School, which we must acknowledge is in Lenape territory. Oscar Santillán is founder of Studio Antimundo. He's an Ecuadorian artist and cybernetician who continuously collaborates with diverse knowledge producers, ranging from scientists to plants. Thank you so much, Oscar, for being part of the Afro and Indigenous Future series. And we're very happy to have you here with us today. Okay, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jose, and thanks to the entire team of the Afro and Indigenous Future series. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today. So I'm going to share my screen, and then we see where this takes us to. Here. So let's start here with interfaces for the Earthverse. We'll start with this person. We'll start with Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff. He is someone who has been deeply influential to me. He is one of the members of the liberation theology in Latin America, and one of the many people who gravitated from the more traditional left to more ecological understanding in the 1990s. In the around year 1980, he published a book titled Iglesia, Carisma y Poder, or Iglesia, Charisma and Power. And that book was very controversial within the Catholic Church. He basically proposed this. He proposed to invert the whole structure of the Catholic Church. In a way, what he proposed was to decentralize. That's the way I see it nowadays. He proposed to decentralize the Catholic Church by proposing that the people, everyone, should be able to have direct access to God without having to go through the due process of the ecclesial bureaucracy of the church. So this didn't land well with the hierarchy of the church, and he ended up being expelled. But there is an idea that he started developing around that time, and even before, and it really consolidated or crystallized in the following decade, in the 1990s. And it's what he called the dimension of care. And the dimension of care could be explained or could be described as in this way. It would be described as the impulse, the commitment to care for those overlooked. Those overlooked are those who are being expelled by the political, the financial system, by those who are abused, humans, animals, ecosystems, all the living entities on planet Earth who are just instrumentalized by the system. And in many cases, not even that, but just totally ignored. And what I thought, as when I was inspecting, when I was going through his ideas, was that I wanted to extend the outreach of his ideas, of Leonardo Boff's idea. And I was started to ask myself, why not to care for what doesn't even exist? For what breeds, what mutates, what grows on the periphery of vision of our normative reality. And by normative reality, I could also say normative histories, normative modernities, normative civilizations, the normative futures that we are imagining, or rather that we are not capable of imagining. So this notion of what is in the periphery of vision, what is in the periphery of vision of our civilizations, of our political systems, of our financial systems, of our systems of representation, is really what interests me. This is what I call Antimundo, what lies in the periphery of vision of modernity, of history. Another way of describing this term is this is a contact zone for shadows. And the reason why I'm introducing you to this notion specifically is because this is at the very foundation of my practice. How this appears, not as a topic, but rather as an impulse inside my work, inside my practice. This is an image of the first map drawn by Christopher Columbus upon arrival in the Americas. This is drawn in 1492. This map was brought to my attention by historian Irlando Inoa in the Dominican Republic. I was there in 2016. And he's the one who mentioned this. He brought about this document to me. He told me the following story, which is that the first thing that Columbus asked the Taino natives who inhabited large part of this island. Let me just, before I continue, let me explain something from the map. So what we see here is a part of the coast or the outline of what is nowadays the Dominican Republic and Haiti, or what Columbus called La Española. And what we see on the upper part is the Atlantic Ocean. What Orlando told me is that the word gold was mentioned about 50. Another thing mentioned in his diaries that he thought was remarkable or intriguing, and is that the first thing that Columbus does, arriving in the Americas, once he gets in contact with the Taino natives, is that he asks where he can find gold. The Tainos, according to his own diaries, tell him that there is an island called Baneke where he can find all the gold that he's searching for. And he goes for about 2 months into searching for an island that doesn't exist, or at least doesn't exist in our normative reality. I asked Orlando, why did the Tainos tell this story to Columbus? And he mentioned that, well, it was unclear. We have to keep in mind that the Tainos were nearly exterminated just a few decades after the arrival of Columbus. It's calculated that potentially about 2 million Tainos died in the following decades to this arrival. What he told me is that potentially this could have been a story that is part of the cosmology of the Taino natives, or is something that perhaps they just made up to get rid of this annoying guy. What I decided is that it would be interesting to try to search the island that the so-called quote-unquote discoverer of the Americas didn't quote-unquote discover. But you know, in order to find such an island, in order to find Baneke, you need to find, or at least I didn't want to do it in a metaphorical way. I wanted to find legitimate means to do that. What I said to myself was, all right, the starting point for this search should be the document. Let's commit to that. Let's be faithful to the document, to this map. And what I noticed is that there was literally a missing area in the map. There is this hole here in the Atlantic Ocean that has the perfect shape of an island. And that's where I thought, all right, this is the island, literally speaking, it has the shape of an island. It is absent from the map because there is no matter there. It is a hole. So I'm going to cartograph it, and I'm going to travel there. And that's what I did. I physically traveled to the hole in the map in search for Baneke. When I arrived there, to my disappointment, no island could be found. So I decided to gather several gallons of water with me from that location. I brought them with me, and for the following weeks and months, I let it dry. And what happens when you let ocean water dry under the influence of the sun in a slow process is that this water crystallizes, or rather, all the salts and minerals in the water crystallized. And this was the result in the end. So at the end of the process, this physical entity, this island, this object, this, you would say, perhaps this living document of the expedition emerges. The hole in the map is crystallized. And I jokingly say sometimes that this is perhaps, or well, certainly at this point, the only piece of real estate that I own. It's also, you know, through this process also, I started to differentiate certain, to make a distinction between the map, the landscape, and the ecology that inhabits that landscape. This is an image of a Wardian case. Wardian cases are a 19th century derivative of greenhouses. These were colonial structures aimed at enclosing within plants brought mostly from the European colonies into the continent. So they were this fictional environment where tropical and all kinds of plants that were not endemic to Europe could be kept alive as a display of power and knowledge. I thought for the following project that I'm about to describe, which is titled Forecast, I decided to work with these colonial references. What I proceeded to do is to use the same material as would be used for these structures. That were, in this case, I made these with the support of wonderful experts and colleagues that I often collaborate with. We made this metal structure that you see here on the left. And it is a hexagon, so it has 6 sides. And each side hosts a screen. What you see here are the 6 screens already positioned on the metal structure. And inside, there is a garden, a real garden. This is a moment, this is just part of the documentation of the process. This is the moment when the gardener is adding some water to the garden before we fully enclose the plants inside. Something to be mentioned is that this is not an arbitrary garden. So this is a garden of colonial plants. So this is a garden or an ecology, a colonial ecology. So I decided to find those plants that were brought to the European continent throughout the 18th, the 19th, and even the early 20th century. And they were displayed back in the day and still nowadays into greenhouses, for instance, and they were brought through Wardian cases, which I show you are scale models of greenhouses. We did the research, we found the list of plants, and then we were able to put together this colonial garden. And then what the screens are showing to the plants are apocalyptic films. So we also made this playlist of apocalyptic films throughout the entire history of film. And after positioning the screens, positioning the garden, watering it, we came into closing this garden or our own greenhouse or Wardian case. So this is a 20th century, or you would call it also an Anthropocene version of these colonial ideas, extrapolated to our technologies and to the possibility of aligning or these colonial gardens. So it's a connection between colonial gardens from the 19th century and technologies of the 21st century. What happens once the whole structure is enclosed, and this is my friend Sebastian Robert, who also assists me at the studio, yes, doing the last touches of the piece. This was shown within the greenhouse at the Ratti Foundation in Italy. And this is a view of the work. And here you see the 6 screens, this metal top like a dome, and everything black. The function of this more radical 21st century Anthropocene version of these 19th century ideas is that the actual sunlight is being blocked. So the plants inside this colonial garden is kept alive only by the light of the apocalyptic films being shown inside. So it is, the way I see it is that there is this sort of new history of survival that is very uncomfortable. Is the survival of plants that are kept alive throughout the end of the world. The only way in which you as a viewer can look inside is by means of this pinhole on the top. This is curator Lorenzo Benedetti, one of the curators of the show at the Ratti Foundation, looking in. And here we have some images of the pinhole. Here I have a close-up of the lens on the top of the dome, and this is what you see. So actually, as a viewer, you don't, the lens is very narrow, so you can see the garden, but you only see the glow of this end of the world impacting the plants, moving, mutating, and also the audio of these several movies being played at the same time. Going back to some notes on the spirit of my work and the ideas that I want to share today for discussion is that I'm attempting to be, I'm attempting to be attentive rather than only being critical, or being attentive before being critical. If we consider for a second that being critical is to, in the most literal sense, it means to analyze, to impose some kind of a pre-existing grid that we have in our mind about values, prejudices, ideas upon reality. And I think it is very important that in order to notice the edges of reality, we need to hold our judgment, at least for a moment, and to look what is there before the judgment is enacted. Imposing our ideological grid over endlessly complex realities is not an example of being critical. is simply prejudiced and ego comforting. This is an image of the Atacama Desert in Chile. This is one of the most fascinating places in the world. The Atacama Desert is the driest and the oldest place on Earth, desert on Earth. Because of its conditions, because of the lack of humidity, it is that observatories such as ALMA, the Extremely Large Telescope, are placed there. And also, this is a testing ground for rovers and some of the vehicles that NASA produces. Back in 2016, I was doing, this impulse came to me to work at the Atacama Desert, to engage with it, and to see what emerged from that experience. So I traveled for the first time. In the end, throughout this whole project I'm about to describe, I went there in a period of a year, 3 times. So the project was finished in 2017. During my first trip, I traveled with this wonderful book that perhaps many of you are familiar with, which is Solaris by Polish sci-fi writer Stanislaw Lem. And this is a wonderful novel. If perhaps you're familiar with the Tarkovsky film, this is a still from the film. But I think a couple of things should be mentioned about this novel before we move into the description of the piece. Solaris places 2 paradoxes in terms of imagining our encounter with extraterrestrials. What happens in Solaris is that, or basically the premise of the novel, is that humanity has encountered this faraway planet, and the entire ocean of the planet is intelligent. It's definitely conscious, is capable of elaborating the most complex images, and it's clear, there is no doubt that the ocean is capable of non-human thinking. So the first paradox in terms of the way we tend to imagine extraterrestrials encounters is that the extraterrestrial, in this case, is an entire ecosystem rather than a humanoid. The other thing that happens is that in the novel, the ocean of Solaris has no interest whatsoever to communicate with humans. While in our normative stories about extraterrestrial encounters, supposedly we humans are some kind of special apes that extraterrestrials are so fascinated by that they have to come all the way here to talk to us and not to any of the other fascinating creatures in this planet. But keep in mind one thing before we move forward. Solaris, you could see it this way. Solaris is proposing a kind of decentralized cognition. So a cognition that doesn't rely in the centralized brain of a mammal, but that is spread all over an entire ecology. And something that I realized during this research is that I came across this word. It's actually a term that I heard so many times when I was growing up in Ecuador, especially in the mountains, in the Andes. I did spend as a kid much time, really, a lot of time with my grandfather's farm. And the word Waka is a word that I heard constantly, and I didn't understand the word really. I would mistakenly associate it with treasures and things like that. And that's really not by any means an appropriate way of describing this incredibly complex and also inspiring term. Anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena explains what a Waka is in a wonderful way. A Waka is something that doesn't fit into any Western category. So it's something that goes beyond, and I'm going to explain it here a bit, and later on I'm going to describe it up to a further extent. One of the ways in which Wakas manifest is in the form of Earthbeings, or tiracunas in Quechua. And Marisol de la Cadena explains that an Earthbeing, as an example, could be described in the following way. Let's say that our community in the Andes recognizes that a certain mountain is an Earthbeing. Then what the community is recognizing is that the mountain is three things simultaneously. It is, first, a geological and ecological reality. We understand that from a Western perspective. Also, it means that the mountain is sacred. That can also be understood from a Western perspective, where the sacred can be compartmentalized and assigned to different aspects of our reality. But there is also a third layer of this, of meaning. And then an Earthbeing or a Waka would mean that, in the case of the example of the mountain, that the mountain is capable of thinking. So that the mountain is capable of non-human thinking. And it doesn't mean that the mountain is some kind of dress for a little spirit or a god that is inside. No, the cognition is like a fountain that emerges from the matter itself. So it is also, could be said, a form of decentralized cognition. And throughout the time of finding the fantastic anthropological work of Marisol de la Cadena, reading Solaris, for me it was very intriguing to find this connection between non-Western sci-fi, in the case of the writings of Polish writer Stanislaw Lem, and the cosmologies and the science and the non-modern science of the Andes. What I did for Solaris, my own version or adaptation of Solaris, was to find my own Solaris in the Atacama Desert. So I gathered several kilograms of sand from the desert. I took them with me. With the support of wonderful experts, we managed to melt that sand into glass. And that glass was consequently turned into photographic lenses. So the desert was turned into photographic lenses. I also decided in that process, when we were melting the glass, not to purify the sand, so to keep the register of the ecological reality of the desert, to see what type of glass would emerge from it. And the glass that came out from it had many anomalies. It was prompted to have bubbles. It had minerals that couldn't be distorted or actually melted. It came out with a strange kind of yellowish, greenish color. And I thought that was great. In a following and last trip to the Atacama Desert, I actually used these photographic lenses to photograph the desert itself. And these are some of the images that came out from those series. And as you see, the landscape becomes not the representation of the landscape in the literal sense. I actually claim that these images are not a representation of the landscape by any means, but they are rather snippets into the cognition, into the subjectivity of the desert itself. What I mean is that in the most literal sense, non-metaphorically speaking, these are images of how the desert looks at itself. And these are views of the installation at Mwak, the museum in Mexico City, where there were 3 different series projected on these walls. And each series was produced with a different lens. And each of these series contained 24 images that would be screened on these walls. I also wanted to share some thoughts or insight into my process, especially at this point, about the relationship between research and making, how to deal with that. This is it's an interesting challenge as an artist, to work with research and to end up with something which is not the linear conclusion of the research. So one of the ways in which I describe my relationship to the research process is that I should honor my research material by betraying it. In other words, the research material can become an entity capable of having its own dreams. So my commitment is towards the dreams that the research material can dream of, but not to the research material in itself. So my hope always is to honor that research material by engaging with its dreams, not with it a linear relationship to the material, but to an emergent reality that could have been predicted beforehand. This is the publication, The Andean Information Age, that came out last year. And this is a book co-written with curator Alessandra Troncone. This is research that has been, well, it has taken a long time, and I'm still working with it. So this comes from Quipus. I'm going to describe this in a second, more in detail. But let me share something about this book. Actually, I'm gonna make a little stop here. So the Andean Information Age is a publication that goes into finding a connection between ancient technologies and emerging technologies. So to find what the potential connections are between Quipus and technologies like VR or artificial intelligence. Of course, I had to tell you what Quipus are. Quipus were a type of device used for at least 5,000 years and still in use in some capacity in the Andes Mountains of South America. And this device could be described from a morphological perspective or a formal perspective as ropes, and those ropes have different knots, and those knots contain information. So the code is actually quite complex because it is not only about the different knots on the ropes that give meaning to what is encoded in a quipu, but it is actually the entire constellation of sensorial input that is possible from this material code. For instance, the color of the ropes would tell you something. The textures is from which animal is this made from. every one of the ropes is made from, because a quipu could contain ropes made from the fur of different animals. Would have different colors as well. You have the knots, and also the twisting of the rope, if it's towards the left or the right, and many other aspects that are part of this very complex code. The reason why I'm not showing you a quipu this morning, an image of a quipu, is because we don't have in the book any images of a quipu, except for one that was generated on 3D, and it's very elusive. It's not very literal. The reason why I decided to do that, or rather, sorry, Alessandra and I decided to do that, is because we wanted to explore the notion beyond archaeology in a way, beyond the fascination for how the object, the device looks. This demanded, I would say, a different approach and some constraints as well. So what a quipu is beyond the form of a quipu? What type of features could be enacted? And here I want to tell you something before moving forward with the presentation. And it is that for me, it would be a failure of the imagination to say that the connection is, let's say, the binary code, zeros and ones. Yes, it is possible to establish a binary code connection between quipus and our digital technologies, but that would actually flatten the complexity of the code. So for me, actually, the connection between quipus and the future is not the binary code, it's not zeros and ones, it's not the digital element. It is rather the fact that a quipu, keep in mind, this code made from ropes and knots, that a quipu is a form of haptic knowledge. Haptic, I'm tempted to say that potentially haptics will be one of the most important words in the 21st century. So haptics could be described as the sensation of having a body, the sensation of having a body. One of the reasons, for instance, virtual reality experiences are not immersive as much as virtual reality creators claim to be the case. They're not immersive. One of the reasons why they're not immersive is because, and this is something that techno-philosopher Jaron Lanier has said, because VR still attached to the 20th century audiovisual centric way of dealing with experiences created in the digital realm. So the centrality of the audiovisual aspects of relationship to our senses that VR have is actually what makes it not immersive, because then the other senses that are so vital to our connection to reality, to the richness of reality, it is not, VR is not going to get better because it gets better, it gets 8K or 20K resolution on the video, on the video aspect. It's not going to get better because of that. It's only going to be better when it becomes very sophisticated in its haptics. And haptics for VR are still very basic. I want to go back to something so I can explain some of the ideas that emerge from this book, and how the ideas in this publication that Alessandra and I work in have really are giving me really a broad door for many projects that are really popping up from this research. So this is let me read this. Anthropologist Tamara Bray has written about one of these chroniclers. This is a Spanish chronicler, Cristóbal de Albornoz, who compiled a long and seemingly disparate list of phenomena considered to be wakas. Remember, I was speaking about wakas before. That included aphrodisiacal flies and birds, places where lightning had struck, ancestral mummies, mountain passes, replicas of plants, bezoar stones, and the hallucinogen known as vilca, among other things. So the way in which wakas manifest the power of the waka, this power that emerges from matter itself, not from a spirit inhabiting matter, is this is what I meant when I told you before that waka does not fit into any Western grid. This was a quote unquote problem for the Spanish who wanted to destroy wakas, because in order to destroy something, you have to gain at least some basic understanding about it so that you can identify it. This was really way beyond what could be identified, pointed to. In the end, many of the chroniclers of the early phases of the colonial times in Latin America, they just gave up together, like altogether, on trying to describe what a waka is, because the terming itself was way beyond anything that would fit into their mental and ideological grids. So from this notion of what a waka can be, I have started this series of work. These are 3D models that combine different elements. Elements that this is part of one of the images. The next part is here, and I'm combining these very divergent ecologies, materials that cannot be described, hair, fur, stones, different type of ecological presences. But they are all mixed, they are all entangled. They are all becoming an entity beyond biological descriptions or morphological descriptions from a scientific perspective. And here you have also elements like a quipu. These are 3D model quipus that emerge from there. And the way I display this type of images that we've been creating at the studio is, like in this case, this work becomes this light box, and I also exaggerated the cables needed for the light box. I also want to emphasize the materiality of the light box by changing the shape of the light box, not in an arbitrary way, but actually the shape is changed based on some designs, lines that appear, and content as well that appears in Andean weavings from all types of centuries. Another work that emerged from this set of ideas is also titled The Andean Information Age. And what we see here is an analog 35 millimeters slide projector that, as you would know, they are discontinued already for between 2 and 3 decades ago, depending where you are. So what we decided to do at the studio was to hack this analog device to mix technologies. So we implemented an Arduino system that now is controlling the 35 millimeters apparatus, the analog device, and then is turning the the slide projector into a cinematographic device in a way, because now we can decide how long every single slide stays on view. We also added one layer of sound, so we have sound synchronized with every one of these slides, and everything is programmed so that this is about a 30 minutes piece in total. This is how the world looks. So it is this vertical, very large projection, departing from images that come from these colonial descriptions of Wakas, this impossibility of describing what Wakas are, and also some elements that I have introduced in this visual ecology. And I wanted to show you one that I'm going to share here.
The Andean Information Age. Once there was a form of material writing, a three-dimensional way of encoding textual and numeric information. It was called quipus, a word meaning knots in the Quechua language. By means of quipus, the Incas stored precise data gathered on each community and each individual inhabiting the vast empire. The Spaniards could not have hoped for a better record regarding the peoples and resources available in their newly conquered territories. The reckless Catholic campaigns of the extirpation of idolatries carried out the eradication of quipus. The extirpations extended all the way from Mesoamerica to the last corner of the Andes. The history of knowledge burning is profuse. In reality, cosmologies cannot be erased by brute force. At most, they are pervasively sunk somewhere deep inside people. Out of view, but not out of existence. Every empire rules by building new realities upon repressed memories. Censorship is no longer executed by pouring gasoline over piles of books. Nowadays, the burning happens inside the user. Even the very concept of censorship is becoming outdated. The aim of the current power structures is to hack the cognition of the individuals, to manipulate from the inside rather than suppress from the outside. Book burning has been replaced by behavior manipulation.
The 3D images that you just saw there, they were placed into each of those images was converted into these old-fashioned 35 millimeter films. So that was also interesting to have this dialogue, this tension between different technologies that are not supposed to mix. And for me, it was also a way of relating in a smaller scale with this notion of old, ancient, disregarded technologies and emerging or newer technologies. So we all have heard that those who don't know their history are doomed. And I would like to think about the following. Those who don't know their history are doomed to live in the future. This is a way of saying that while knowing the past is important, it shouldn't become a fixation, or even worse, the past shouldn't ever become a fixed place that can be reinstituted as a memory. The past should be embraced as fluctuation. And the following piece, for me, is the most sci-fi related work in my practice. What we see here is part of the process of this work. This is an actual piece of Chimu Fabric. This is 1,000 years old. This piece of fabric that you see here, I found it on eBay. This was very intriguing to me because there is a remarkable difference between you as an archaeologist finding or excavating a piece like this one, and being able, because of the relationship, the spatial relationship, other traces, context, that amount of information that context gives you about an object is incredibly valuable as an archaeologist. But what about all these pieces of history, of humanity's past that circulate on places like eBay, like this one, like this Chimu weaving? The context for this piece is eBay. The context for this piece is a corporation, it's a digital corporation. So this object has largely lost its memory. So what I thought is, I would like to find a way to create another memory for this object and for other objects like this one. So what I proceeded to do, and the process is a bit, has some tensions, let's say. What I decided is to take it apart and then to incorporate it along with other 10 weavings from 10 different centuries, being the oldest one, the Chimu one that we just saw, and the latest one being from the 20th century, from different places in the world, different histories, and to incorporate them into this new material history of or planetary history. So all these different weavings from 1,000 years, and the title of the piece is precisely 1,000 years of non-linear history, quoting it from the wonderful book by, my apologies right now, the name of the philosopher has escaped my mind. It's going to come back to me in a second, hopefully. And what is the work it tries to be precisely this new reality, or this possibility rather of a new reality, of a history that is not set with words but is set with materials, with a history that couldn't have been in this way, a history that somehow supersedes coloniality, that supersedes the linear connections that on the linear time that the West imposed everywhere. And now, just to wrap things up, I'm going to share a few thoughts about the research that I'm carrying out at the moment. I don't know what Web3 is. One way of describing Web3 among many is that Web3 is the metaverse of the metaverses. So I don't know what Web3 is, but I know what Web 4 may be like. Web 4 may be an interspecies blockchain. And here I'm going to have to perhaps quickly describe something, because I'm aware that the word, these two words, interspecies and blockchain, are multi-layered, and I'm just going to be brief here. Well, interspecies, I'm just going to take it by on face value, by what literally it means. And regarding blockchain, I just want to say that for those who are not yet very familiar with blockchain technologies, blockchain is basically an immutable open ledger, or you can also see it as an accounting book, that is decentralized. Cryptocurrencies are part of blockchain technologies. NFTs are part or are emerging from blockchain technologies. DAOs, DeFi, and many other social digital phenomena are emerging from blockchain technologies. This is a very contingent topic, is contentious rather. So I would not stop there. I think perhaps in the Q&A we can discuss these ideas further. But the reason why blockchain technologies interest me are two. Because it's a technology for decentralization. And keep in mind that throughout the talk, one of the topics that I've been going back to is the idea of decentralized cognition. Can it be that somehow we hacked blockchain technologies in order for them not to be vehicles of rampant hyper-capitalism, but that they can be actually hacked for other purposes? I don't know if better or not, but just for other purposes that are not normative. I think the space of blockchain has already become very, very normal, very normalized. So I wonder how to disrupt that. Being the case that the tool in itself, if we for a second forget the financial dynamics, the very nosy financial dynamics broadly happening in that space, but the tools could be hacked for other purposes. So that's what I'm wondering. And what I call this interspecies blockchain, basically, and what these two words together would mean, which when they converge, I call it the Earthverse rather than the metaverse. So the metaverse, as you know, as an escape from our reality, is not very interesting to me. But the Earthverse, as a reminder of our reality, is very interesting to me. This idea came to me, actually not from blockchain itself, but came to me from cybernetics. I have come across the work of especially two cyberneticians, Gordon Pask and Stafford Beer. And these two characters are incredibly remarkable. And Stafford Beer, he was he was really a central figure to the CyberSync project in Chile. There was this cybernetic project during the times of the Allende government, the socialist government of the early 1970s. And it's a project that is a kind of pre-internet project that tried to connect the different factories that were being nationalized by the revolutionary government so that they can coordinate action with these this very different new approach. And one day, I think perhaps we can make a chapter 2 when we can only focus into the connection between cybernetics, blockchain, ecology, artificial intelligence. For now, I'm sharing a few thoughts about it. But let me get back to the beginning of this research. So this is a page that I'm showing you here. Might not tell you much, more, I mean that much, but this is a page from a book by Gordon Pask. Let me just read here the description that he has here. So he says, a real-life modular processor. So nature as computers, that's one of the premises that Gordon Pask and Stafford Beer explored. Every element in this pond, weeds, algae, bacteria, is in some sense independent, but also controlled by day length, temperature, and rainfall. So this is an ecosystem, right, with very complex processes happening in this pond and very different levels of reality. Stafford Beer created an experiment in 1961 with a pond like this one. And he created a magnetic field around the pond. And then he proceeded to do something kind of awful, but it's part of the story. He fed these little creatures that live on the pond, water fleas. He fed them with iron so that they could be responsive to the magnetic field. His intention wasn't to control the water fleas, but actually to get the magnetic field to feel the movement of the fleas, of the water fleas. In that sense, and this is a term coined by both Pask and Beer, he coined the term biological computing. What they thought is, why do we have to build computers when what we can do instead, since all elements in nature compute, is to rather try to get in dialogue with a natural computer, with a biological computer. And that's what they saw they were trying to do. So they created this magnetic field around the pond. Some of these little creatures could be, their movement could be raised in the magnetic field. And then this magnetic field was being transformed into electricity. So it could be read by a computer, or interpreted by a computer. The experiment failed. I've been very intrigued by this experiment. For me, what they were trying to do, and I'm interpreting with my own words, they were trying to find an interface to communicate with Earth beings. And they failed, but the attempt, I think, is quite intriguing. And this is an image from one of Stafford Beer's diaries. This has been kindly and generously facilitated to us, among other images, by the Stafford Beer archive in the UK. And what we see here are the fluctuations in the magnetic field that were being registered. And as a conclusion, or just as a last thought, with this research on recovering the history of biological computers, which by no means I'm the first one. I'm actually very inspired by the work of historian of science Andrew Pickering. I really recommend, his book, The Cybernetic Brain. And the cybernetic brain has a section dedicated to biological computers. And it's like what I've been feeling is that on this periphery of vision, on these shadows of our normative reality, there is a matrix where nonlinear connections between different temporalities can be established, between different ways of knowing, between different ontologies could be established. That's what I call the Earthverse. And my hope is that by creating somehow some sort of not yet existing interspecies blockchain, that we could create a path for communication between very divergent entities, such as ecosystems, such as artificial intelligence, such as humans. But because one big challenge that we have towards our emerging future is precisely how are we gonna able to communicate, and that communication has to be non-verbal. I feel it is a failure of the imagination when we are trying to convert, for instance, whale sounds into human language by means of AI, which has been done. I think the real challenge is to find the non-human language, the decentralized non-human language that may allow us to create a form of communication that is non-hierarchical, that is decentralized, and that would allow us to learn by knowing and meeting each other, no matter how different the different participants in the system are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oscar. It's been a wonderful lecture. Well, let's go with the Q&A section. Do people have any questions up to now?
Caroline, I just read Caroline saying hello. Hi, Caroline. A very good friend and thinker. So for those who are interested on the dialogue between AI and the arts, she has a wonderful podcast that you can follow.
Awesome. Okay, we have one question. Loria Clark says, can you talk a little bit more about the role of time in the discussion of non-human decentralized intelligences, such as Solaris, or more broadly within the idea of Waka? Apologies if I missed the spelling there. How does the interface aid us in bridging the rifts between human time and geological or biological time, particularly in the context of interspecies communication?
Well, let me say something about timing more in general. I think it is one of those many dimensions of the so-called Antimundo, of this periphery of vision of our normative reality, is that different temporalities are required in order to find, so for different participants, very distinct participants or divergent participants to encounter each other, who might not be able to encounter each other in linear time. When I said beforehand, some minutes ago, that my piece, 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, is the most sci-fi work of my practice, is because it's a work that literally engages with different temporalities. And that's what sci-fi does in reality. Most sci-fi is not really about the future, most sci-fi is about the possibility of imagining other temporalities where other connections can be established. And I think, that principle of science fiction, I think, is very much needed for us to find ways of living. So the method for how is that this can be implemented isn't clear to me. I'm in the midst of learning, experimenting, but if I can move for a second to the topic of decentralized cognition that was also mentioned in the question. What happens is that one of the lines of research that I'm following at the moment is to see the way in, the work that is being carried out by researchers on neurobiology, a field also called plant intelligence or plant cognition or biological mutualism. And some of those researchers are applying AI. So I have met with a really interesting researcher here in Amsterdam who is applying AI to analyze the architecture of the mycelium network that lives in the soil of our planet. To see what the architecture means in terms of of its interactions with all the different participants in the network. So AI is being implemented there. I think so. The connections between complex cognitions, complex biological cognitions, and artificial intelligence is already being implemented at some level. With constraints, because these are, these are incredibly complex systems, both of them. What I'm trying to do is to say, in the midst of these emerging connections, of these bridges between the artificial and the biological, what type of questions can be placed for us to imagine other futures? So that I know my answer is not very descriptive or linear, but that's the way I think at this point I can relate to it.
Well, I'm curious about thinking about what you mentioned as Antimundo in general, these visions that are kind of in the margin of normative everything, right? What do you hope, or what have you learned? What do you hope to learn, or what do you have learned from these visions, which of course like kind of shed a different light upon what is understood as the human, and also what is understood as reality itself. Yeah, that.
Some years ago, during the presidency of Donald Trump, writer Naomi Klein took a break from the events. She took a break from Twitter, and she decided to really think of a productive way of engaging with those dark political times. And she started writing her book about Trump's presidency and how to deal with it from a progressive perspective. And one thing that she mentioned is that, that was important for her, is that she noticed that if you were reactive, basically you were not productive, because the political strategy of someone like Trump was to get you into you can be as critical as possible, as you wish, but then you would be reacting to, to the latest thing that came to his mind. And you would be endlessly placed in a reactive position. And she advocated for a more productive, non-reactive way of relating to that political reality. And for me, when I think about what is the function of Antimundo, identifying these ancient but also emerging realities that are not fully registered or don't fully fit into the grid of our normative world, is precisely to find non-reactive ways of engaging with reality, ways that are not about me reacting to what some politician is doing, to the those things are like I do believe, of course, that there are moments when reactive positions are important. When you have to defend someone, for instance, it's important that you react to what is going on. But I think it is problematic when we can only engage in reactive ways with a very complex reality. And that's what for me, that's what I'm hoping for, to get from this notion of Antimundo, to have this pool of options to engage with that are non-reactive.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so in a way, it would be kind of reclaiming agency from this, like this condition of the Anthropocene, which some people like conceive it as a time of passiveness, right? Because you have this kind of political and ontological constraints, like factual constraint, which menaces existence and all of that. That is awesome. Thank you. Does anyone have another question, perhaps? Well, I do have another question. Given that this practice, this art practice of yours, kind of ties up like a kipu, different instances from reality that are not necessarily bound to be together, like according to history, right? Do you have like a preference or a guiding criteria that a preference for what do we have to tie up in order to have a feeling of like unexplored events of this history that is kind of really linear and with one single voice? Do you have like a preference of like topics that you like to tie up to make them encounter? Yeah.
Well, the matrix is very open, but definitely there are topics that for me are really in my heart. Some of those are related to lost histories of science in Latin America, to also the history of cybernetics and the role that Latin America play in the history of cybernetics as well. I'm definitely intrigued by possibilities emerging from artificial intelligence, and also to explore the limits of the kind of machine learning approaches that are more commonly used. You know, this kind of like the systems that needs are this kind of like data bulldozers that gather as much data as possible in order to find patterns. I'm very curious to see what other possibilities are being explored beyond systems that are dependent on the accumulation of data. And I would say, yeah, those are some of the topics that I'm really engaged with. And in addition to some of the things I have mentioned before, like neurobiology, you know, I'm interviewing researchers in that field as well as part of my work. And people also, I'm also very intrigued about blockchain technologies and what kind of role they can play when we kind of like take them away from the financial dynamics that are very prominent in those spaces. So I would say those are some of the topics.
Awesome. Also, well, it just as a comment, it gave me kind of goosebumps just to think about, for example, how you addressed for example, colonial history through your project. I don't remember what was the name, but that one that you went to this literal void in the map to gather water, which then becomes a crystallized island. It is just fascinating. With that, okay, we're closing into the scheduled time that we should finish this event. But yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Oscar. Thank you a lot. I see that there's a new message. Oh, there's another question. Perhaps we can have this last question. And do you have time, Oscar?
Sure.
Okay. It says, sorry. If haptic is probably the key for future Earthbeing communication, what place does it have the AI advances? What place does it have the AI advances? And how the interaction of Earthbeings and cybernetics beings is seen from your perspective if humans are not in the center of the reflection? If cybernetics and being cybernetics a human product, do you think it's possible new partnerships between other species and cybernetics without human as an operator?
That's a great thought, and really inspiring. Thanks, Daniela, for because I mean I'm going to comment on these thoughts and questions, but definitely what Daniela is placing there surprises anything very specific that I could address right now in a couple of minutes, and I think it deserves even a back and forth to really think together. But so let me specifically focus for now on the notion of cybernetics and what type of role this could have. So as many of you would know, cybernetics could be described as a way of identifying and creating and designing systems that are self-regulating. In other words, that are homeostatic. So in that sense, I feel there is an interspecies desire for the beginning of cybernetics. as many of you would know, the first book, not the first paper, the first paper on cybernetics, the first paper on cybernetics, it's a paper co-written by Bigelow, by Rosenbluth, who was a Mexican scientist, and also, of course, by Wiener. Wiener published these books. This famous book, I think, comes out in 1948, which is titled Cybernetics, Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. So the very title, this is considered kind of the foundational text for cybernetics. The very title of that book tells you about an interspecies desire in cybernetics. This control and communication and the animal and the machine. It has to be said that control in that title really has nothing to do with control from a hierarchical simplistic point of view. So it's not about taming the animals by putting them into some kind of like electronic cages or anything of that sort. What control means, it might be interesting to mention this, what control means in cybernetics is actually the way you deal with negative feedback, which basically means you have a goal and then you're moving towards the goal, but you see that there is a discrepancy between the direction in which you are moving and the goal. So you have to adjust. So that's negative feedback. So you have to adjust your behavior in order to align to the goal. So that's what is called control in cybernetics. And that goal can be a common goal. It doesn't have to be a goal decided by the CEO of a corporation. It's a goal that can be established communally. So let me add one note here, which is that precisely, I think one of the reasons why we should pay attention to blockchain technologies is specifically because of a problem that happens here, like how for any interspecies assembly, you need a consensus mechanism, right? That's very important. And that consensus mechanism, I suspect, is non-verbal. So it's not written in English. But what's something that's interesting that's happening now in blockchain is that there is a lot of experimentation on different consensus mechanisms that are being experimented by DAOs, by decentralized autonomous organizations. They are far from really, solving big problems, but I think the experimentation on consensus in the blockchain space is incredibly interesting, and is probably politics. It has a lot to learn, and political organizations in the whole political spectrum, I think, should pay attention to what is happening there, because there's a lot to learn for many of us. Going back to the topic, so the question is like, how do you align this interspecies desire? How do you create a consensus? So one of the roles of cybernetics is that a system has to be created to accommodate these different impulses, these different agendas, these different agencies rather, to come together. So, and that system needs to some kind of like self-regulatory characteristics. And that's really at the very foundations of cybernetics. So in what I'm telling you, there is an interspecies desire, or rather a desire for interspecies communities that are possible by means of these decentralized systems. The questions remain totally open. If you push me farther for a more specific answer, I couldn't give it to you right now. So these are, premises and early thoughts that I'm just kind of like putting together in order to create the new projects that I'm developing. And I think it's going to be a step-by-step process of little experiments to get somewhere.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think we're out of time, so we will wrap it up here. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. Thank you, especially Oscar. Your work is amazing and very inspiring, and I think it's really important to talk about it in this series, which is precisely about the future from a subaltern perspective, from subaltern perspectives. So without further ado, thank you so much for coming. And
thank you, Jose, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Really, yeah, has been an honor.